If you've ever tried burying kitchen scraps in your garden or containers, you already know how the story usually ends. Within days, something digs them up. Rodents smell fresh food instantly. Even when they don't surface, the scraps rot badly, turn anaerobic, and stunt nearby roots. Many modern gardeners give up here and assume composting is the only option. Ancient growers didn't. They use fermentation to transform scraps into something plants crave and pests actively avoid. This wasn't a convenience trick. It was a survival strategy, especially in dense settlements where rodents were everywhere. Why are rodents attracted to raw scraps but avoid fermented material? Well, rodents are drawn to sugars, starches, and fresh proteins. Raw scraps broadcast those signals loudly through the soil. Fermentation changes the chemistry completely. Lactic acid bacteria consume the sugars first, lowering pH and producing organic acids that rodents dislike. The smell shifts from food to processed matter. To us, it smells sour. To rodents, it signals something already claimed by microbes and not worth the risk. This is the key difference. Fermented scraps are no longer food. They are soil amendments. How does ancient fermentation differ from modern composting? Traditional composting relies on oxygen and heat. Fermentation relies on exclusion of air and time. Ancient farmers often fermented scraps in sealed pits, clay jars, or wooden barrels before returning them to the soil. This preserved nutrients instead of burning them off as heat. Nitrogen stayed locked in organic acids instead of escaping as gas. That's why fermented material feeds plants faster once buried. Nothing valuable was lost in the process. So, how does the fermented scrap method actually work in practice? The method is simple but disciplined. Kitchen scraps are chopped small to increase surface area. They are packed tightly into a container, excluding as much air as possible. Salt, bran inoculated with beneficial microbes, or even a small amount of previous ferment can be added to kickstart the process. The container is sealed and kept at moderate temperature. Over 1 to 2 weeks, the scraps soften, sour, and partially break down. There is no rot smell. If it smells putrid, air got in. Now, let's talk about why fermentation preserves nutrients better than, well, just letting things rot in the open. When scraps simply decay in the soil, the proteins in them break down into ammonia, which unfortunately tends to escape into the air. But with fermentation, those proteins are converted into amino acids and organic nitrogen compounds that, actually stay put and remain stable. Minerals like potassium and phosphorus are released as well, but crucially, they're not leached away. When this fermented material is added to the soil, microbes immediately recognize it as something they can use, almost like a ready meal. Roots benefit indirectly because microbial activity spikes around the fermented matter, releasing nutrients gradually rather than all at once. So, why do plants respond so strongly to these fermented inputs? Well, it's not because they absorb the fermented scraps directly. Instead, they benefit from what the fermentation process triggers in the soil. You see, soil microbes multiply rapidly around fermented material simply because it's so easy for them to digest. That microbial bloom releases enzymes, organic acids, and growth-promoting compounds. Roots naturally extend toward all that activity. In container tests, plants grown with these fermented scrap amendments showed, noticeably thicker stems and a much deeper colour, since nutrient uptake was continuous rather than, say, spiky. It's really quite fascinating. This mirrors how ancient soils managed to stay fertile for decades without any synthetic input. And now, let's cover how this method helps prevent rodents, even in raised beds and containers. Once scraps have been fermented, they just lose their attraction for pests. When you bury them, they don't broadcast those food signals anymore. Rodents that do come across them usually abandon the spot after just one investigation. In raised beds, fermented material is buried deeper than raw scraps because it compresses quite easily. In containers, it's mixed into the lower soil layers, never left near the surface. This placement is really important. Fermented material ends up feeding roots from below, right where moisture and microbial life are already concentrated. So, let's walk through how to apply this method step by step without attracting pests. First, you'll want to start by collecting your vegetable scraps, coffee grounds, and any cooked grains, as long as they don't have oils. Chop them up into small pieces. Next, pack them tightly into a sealable container. If you have it, sprinkle in just a small amount of salt or some inoculated bran. Then compress everything down firmly and seal the container. Let it ferment until it smells sour, but not foul. When it's ready, dig a hole at least a hand's depth, place the ferment in, cover it fully, and give it a light watering. Don't use it as a surface mulch. Always keep it underground, where the microbes can do their work. Now, you might be wondering why this method fits so well with traditional soil-building systems. Well, this wasn't just some fringe knowledge. Fermentation was actually common in East Asian, Nordic and Mediterranean farming systems. These techniques helped reduce waste, fed the soil efficiently and avoided pest problems, especially in crowded environments. The method worked because it respected soil biology rather than overwhelming it. And you know, modern science now confirms what those farmers saw for themselves. Fermented organic matter integrates into the soil faster and more safely than raw inputs. So, why does this method matter for resilient, low-input growing? Well, fermented scraps can really reduce how much you depend on store-bought fertilizers. They help close the nutrient loop right at home. Plus, they prevent pest problems before they even start. Most importantly, though, they actually build soil life instead of disrupting it. Once you start using this method, your scraps stop being waste and start becoming a controlled, powerful resource. If this has changed the way you think about feeding your soil without feeding pests, go ahead and subscribe to Hydrohaven. Share this with growers who are tired of fighting rodents and help keep these proven old-world methods alive by actually using them.